to acknowledge that the festival is held on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to elders of any other communities who may be here with us today. My name's Veronica Sullivan. I'm on the board of the Feminist Writers Festival, and I'd like to thank you all very much for coming out this morning for this session, It's Personal, Feminism and Narrative Nonfiction. Before we begin, please remember to turn your phones to silent, because there's always one. But we would love you to join in the conversation on social media using the hashtag FWF2018. Please be aware that we are live streaming and recording this session, and so questions from the audience during question time will be included in the recording. Now please join me. I'm going to introduce our speakers. On the far end, we have Dr. Anne Summers, AO. Anne has been prominent in Australian media, politics, and as a feminist activist for the past 4 decades. She's advised governments, been an award-winning journalist, edited magazines in Australia and in New York, led the international environmental organisation Greenpeace, and even had her image on a postage stamp. She's the author of 8 books, including the classic Damned Whores and God's Police, Ducks on the Pond, The Lost Mother, and The Misogyny Factor. Next to Anne is Fiona Wright. Fiona is a writer, editor, and critic from Sydney. Her book of essays, Small Acts of Disappearance, won the 2016 Kibble Award and the Queensland Literary Award for nonfiction. Her poetry collections are Knuckled, which won the 2012 Dame Mary Gilmore Award, and Domestic Interior, and her new essay collection is The World Was Whole. Third along, we have Siv Parker. Siv is an award-winning writer, a social media practitioner, and an informed and insightful commentator on Australian life, history and values, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues. And nearest to me is Zoya Patel. Zoya is the founding editor of Feminazi and the former editor-in-chief of Lip magazine. She was highly commended in the Scribe Publishing Non-Fiction Prize 2015 and was a 2014 recipient of the Anne Edgeworth Young Writers Fellowship. She was named the 2015 ACT Young Woman of the Year. Her debut book, No Country Woman, is a memoir of not belonging, and it's out now. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you all. I'm really excited to get stuck into this conversation. Before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also just like to say, we're at a Feminist Writers Festival. I think it's really important that we note that any move towards gender equality has to be grounded in reconciliation. So, as someone who is young and therefore gets asked repeatedly what on earth I could possibly have written a memoir about, I think it would be great to start off by asking you guys what drove you to write from a personal perspective. Now, we did talk about this a little bit earlier. So, Siv, I know that partly for you, it's about playing witness to, I suppose, the experiences of Indigenous people in Australia to a degree. Would you agree?
Yes. I guess the first thing, when I first started writing, I had a whole heap of ideas about why I was writing, but the longer that you write a memoir, when you're writing about yourself, as I was saying this morning, once you start excavating yourself, then what you think at the beginning is not what, in my case anyway, what I think now. So I've been doing this for about 5 years. About halfway into it, I realised that saying that I don't represent all Aboriginal people, this is my perspective, and sort of trying to ground it in myself, actually, I thought, I don't need to say that anymore, you know, because the whole book is from my perspective. So I believe that once you put writing out there, you've got no control over what someone's going to think about it anyway. So there's so many things that I just wasn't going to, I guess, cloud my writing with, like with all of these explanations and disclaimers, and you know, I thought like I could, you know, have half of the book saying what I'm not, because I was worried about what perceptions were. So I thought, how you demonstrate that you're not worried about what perceptions are is don't worry about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anne, this is not your first memoir, but why this book and why at this time for you?
I guess what I wanted to do was this story starts, this book starts with me age 30, and so it covers my life since then. I wanted to tell the story of, basically of Australia. So I see it as a social history and a story of an epoch as much as a story of me. I'm a character in the book rather than necessarily the the key, the centre of it in many parts. I guess that the driving theme of it was I've been fortunate enough to have been born at the cusp of a moment when the world changed for women in a way, and we had opportunities that my mother certainly didn't have, and certainly not my grandmother and women going back. I was born at a time when life seemed to have closed in on me, but we had access to education, which changed everything. Women were starting to go into the workforce, and gradually women started to, do all sorts of things. But when I was a teenager, the only women I saw around me and whose lives I could model myself on were my mother, who was what used to be called a housewife, had 6 children, and her three sisters, 2 of whom were married. One of whom was married like her. The other one was a nun, and the third one was on the shelf, which meant she was a spinster. She was 30 and unmarried, and that was a social tragedy in those days. She, of course, I thought was the most interesting of all of them because she had money and independence.
I was going to say I love being on the shelf.
Yes, exactly. So I just wanted to be able to tell the story of how a girl who grew up with that was her kind of only horizon, how she became the woman I am today. And it's a long story. It takes, it's 40-odd years. And I've been very fortunate to have been offered lots and lots of opportunities in places like the media, in politics, in Greenpeace, in New York, in Canberra, whatever. And so I wanted that story to be one of, if you like, what's possible for all of us. Wherever we start and wherever we find ourselves and wherever we move to, we are in charge of our own lives. And we have to make that life as good as it can be for us. So that's really my driving force in the story.
I think that's fantastic, and I really want to come back to that kind of feminist manifesto aspect of putting those words on the page. But Fiona, this is your second book of personal essays. What keeps you coming back?
That's a very good question. I think I actually intended the second book. I mean, it is much broader than my first collection. I write personal essays to deal with that kind of instability, that sense of the way that you change what you think and you change who you are as you move. That's why I like essays as a form. I think they give you more space to think things through and to have those thoughts and issues develop across time. So this second book, I think, is very much about home and belonging, but it took me a long time to realise that one of the reasons I was so interested in that was because my sense of home and my sense of belonging had been disrupted by my illness, and I am interested in writing about and continuing to write about illness, I suppose, because I don't see that many stories about it around yet. I think that's starting to change. I especially don't, and I think we're starting to see more stories about mental illness in particular, but we're still not seeing as many stories about the very heavily stigmatised mental illnesses like anorexia, and psychoses and things that are a little less. There's been a lot of destigmatising work done around anxiety and depression, I think, and some of the others are still lagging behind. And if you live with these conditions, they affect you every single day, and I really wanted to get a sense across of what that's like.
I think that's really fascinating also in the context of this essay collection being about place and home, and something that really struck me reading it was a lot of that is actually not about physical places so much as it is about the body. And I think that's something that runs through all of our work. My book is about going through the world in a brown body. I think your book is very much about going through the world in a black body. And Anne, we spoke earlier about how so much of your book is actually about the way that gender plays a role in all of those experiences that you unpack. I was saying to Anne earlier that if you read the book without gender, her experience and trajectory could be very similar to, a male journalist at the time, except that gender was always a thing that kept coming up and disrupting that. Do you feel like that's a kind of core aspect of writing personal narrative, is inhabiting the place with your body, Siv?
Well, it's interesting, you say like in a black body. I'm obviously black, and I've got my mother was the eldest of 18 children, so there's a very big black family. but I never...
grandmother must have been a formidable woman.
Her story was that she couldn't read and write. She was on Cherbourg when she was a child. She never even got that education as a domestic, as a 12-year-old, because there was a lot of dislocation. And then she started having children, and she died before she was 50. And she couldn't read and write that whole time. So I do... writing to me is really important for lots of reasons, including that one. But for a long time, I didn't really think about being black. But it was in the course of writing these, because my work is my memoir. What I've done is I've anchored it. It's 50 years. Starts from 1967 to 2017. Because the 1967 referendum was significant for me, even though I was only sort of a toddler, didn't quite realise that. But there's been one kind of Royal Commission or inquiry, or there's been a whole heap of events over the last 50 years that has impacted on me, including up to last year at Uluru. I was at the convention where they developed the Statement of the Heart. So I've framed it around those 50 years, but for most of my life I haven't really thought about being black, but when you write your stories you realise that things that you were denied or the way that you were treated, I can't help but thinking it's because I was black. Yeah. But at the time when you're living through it, I was very optimistic. I still did all the things that I wanted to do. I didn't really, it held me back in ways, not because I was worried that it would define my life, but it was people around me, and it was constantly this thing, oh, you want to do it the black way, or you want to be part of the black group, that kind of corralling of me, or not.
Totally.
Yeah.
The lack of autonomy that's given when somebody is placing that emphasis on you. I think that's really interesting that you say that you didn't see yourself as necessarily inhabiting that place in society, but that wasn't a choice that was afforded to you. Other people were corralling you in that way.
Yeah, and because I adapt to the places that I'm at. If I'm home, obviously we speak differently, we act differently. But that's like anyone. I'm sure we're all different when we go home, so strip off and.
Yeah, and I think that sense of society placing the onus on an aspect of your identity that you don't have control over is something that kind of runs as a theme throughout our work and is often a large theme in narrative nonfiction. And you were saying earlier that for you, Anne in the book is almost like a character. It's not really about you so much as it is about using your experience to share that context in that historical moment that you were part of throughout the period of time from when you were 30 to now. Why did you want to write in that way, not just straight autobiography, but actually putting that political context and critical lens in?
Well, I just think that that's who I am. I mean, you can't, if I'm going to be, if I'm going to write my story and I'm going to situate myself in the history of our era, and I'm going to talk about key events of which I was either part of or observing, and to ignore certain things about me, i.e. the fact I'm female, and that has come sometimes, not always, but as Julia Gillard said the night she was kicked out, gender matters. Sometimes it matters a lot, sometimes it doesn't matter much at all, but it's always there.
Yeah.
And if I can tell you two quick stories to illustrate this. When I was in the Canberra Press Gallery I started there in 1979, and I was the political correspondent for the Australian Financial Review, so I know, I was that. It's a fountain. Yeah. And I was getting to learn the job and trying to meet all the ministers and the bureaucrats and everybody to be able to learn about policy and to write about it. And one of the cabinet ministers said to me, look, if you want to come round to my apartment on Sunday, we can have a bit of a extended chat about some of the portfolio issues. So it's great. So I went round to his apartment and I noticed, the lights were low, the bottle of wine was open, and he wasn't quite wearing a smoking jacket, but it might as well have been. And so I kind of didn't stay very long. Well, I just thought, look, if Laurie Oakes or Paul Kelly or, any of the guys from the gallery had gone round for a chat with the cabinet minister, it wouldn't have been like that. So it was no big deal. I mean, he didn't, attack me or anything like that, but it was just... Still gross. It was... different. And the other story I wanted to tell was, the same time I was in the Canberra Press Gallery, and some of you here may be old enough to remember this, that I got into this huge shit fight with Malcolm Fraser, who was the Prime Minister, because he had denied me a seat on his plane to go around the world. He was doing some big I can see some people nodding who remember it. He was going on a big trip, prime ministerial trip to Washington and London and Bonn and everything. And the Russians had just invaded Afghanistan, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And so I was having this big fight with him, and I was supported by my paper. And Fraser said, well, Summers can't go on the plane. So my boss, who was Max Walsh of the Film Review, said, okay, she's going to go around commercial. So all the airlines are offering me free tickets. And it was a major news story. So I'm, every day giving interviews, talking about what it's like to be having this fight with the Prime Minister, buying my ticket, trying to finish my column, going to get on the plane, so make sure I arrive in Washington before they do, so I can be on the tarmac saying hi. In those days, you could do that. You could get on the tarmac. So I would always be there first and really in their face. So this is all great, but the only thing is that I discovered just before I left that I was pregnant and didn't want to be. And so this was a really kind of, I had to do all this stuff with this additional factor in my life that only a woman would have to deal with, and morning sickness and feeling shitty and knowing I wasn't going to proceed with this pregnancy, but and wondering how in the hell I could get through the 10 days or 2 weeks of the trip. So, and I wrote that into the story, and some people have said, well, did we need to know that? Yes, we did. We did.
I think that really... Oh, sorry, Fiona.
Oh, I just wanted to say that it's officially one of my life goals to get into a fight with the Prime Minister.
There's plenty of time. I think that is one of the crucial issues when we talk about women's personal writing, is that idea that as soon as it's a distinctly female experience, it's somehow too trivial to comment on, or we're adding it in for some biased reason that isn't relevant to everyone else. And it comes to that dichotomy of, female emotional, male rational. Fiona, I'm interested in how you tackle this, because you are writing about mental illness and mental health as well, which are also two areas which people often trivialise and don't give the kind of respect and worth that it requires. How do you balance that when you are writing from a personal experience, but you're clearly making a point about a much broader cultural issue?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to get to this in a sort of roundabout way. I really struggled with the emotional, rational thing. It's one of the things that very often underpins an eating disorder, that the emotional life feels too much, too messy, too extreme. So you try and rationalise everything and kind of act according to rules. And systems, and so it's very much a kind of denying of everything that's emotional and bodily in the place of everything that's rational and brainy. So a really big thing for me in starting to get better or getting better. I use better in the sense of improved rather than better in the sense of well. It's tricky. There needs to be two different words. So one of the things that really I had to address was this kind of disdain for the emotional that I'd picked up. I was going to say somewhere, but I'd picked up from society. Let's face it. And kind of find a way to appreciate, live with, understand the logic of emotions that isn't necessarily rational, but they exist for a reason, and they're telling you things, and they're important. And I guess the reason why I kind of bring together, I'm interested in how personal stories resonate in the world, because I think because I firmly believe that the personal is political. And I I have this fight all the time with one of my friends who's a scientist and a statistician, and he's always like, I hate that phrase, the person is political, because it's just not. And I kind of gave away the punchline there, because he's a man, he's a straight white man, he's a straight white cisgendered able-bodied man, and I'm like, well, congratulations, your personal isn't political, right? But for the rest of us, it is. We do carry these things with us that affect the way we are in the world and the experiences that we have and the way the world reacts to us. And I think the more that we talk about those and connect the experiences that we have in common, the more likely things are to change, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you say that about your straight white man friend, because in writing my book, which is about race, I was really struck by how whenever white journalists were asking me questions, or even white readers sending me comments, they'd often be like, someone mentioned navel gazing, someone else referenced angst. There was a lot of like, oh, you have such a like inward focused gaze or something. And I was like, I'm sure it makes you feel better to individualize this issue and claim that the racism that I've experienced is just a case of me lacking confidence or, you know, me dwelling on my identity. But I think it's really telling that all of the people of colour who've read the book and have contacted me have said, that's the first time I've seen my experiences reflected in something that I've read, or thank you so much for writing that. That really resonated. And I think that is a trivialization of difference, and it's actually a really political act to write from the personal experience when you are writing about a marginalised or a non-mainstream issue in that way.
And I think it's sort of the reason that I wrote the first book in the first place was, so my illness started with a physical condition. I've got a very rare stomach disorder that's long-winded and boring, but it makes me throw up all the time. Well, not all the time, but a lot, without wanting to. And it took a long time to get diagnosed. I lost a lot of weight in the process, and there are changes in your brain that happen when you're malnourished. And it turned out I had all the personality traits that make a person vulnerable to disordered eating in the first place. So, you know, I just got lucky on all fronts. But because I had this physical thing that started before anything else, and that is real, and, you know, it's not really measurable, but I kind of pinned everything that was happening in the way that I was eating and the way that I was existing on the purely physical. This is all I'm doing is managing my condition the same way a celiac, and half the population these days doesn't eat bread, or, you know, a diabetic controls their sugar intake, that sort of thinking. And that was because all of the stories that I'd seen and read about eating disorders and anorexia in particular were about silly, selfish teenagers just going through a phase, who just wanted to be pretty or just wanted to be thin. And I was like, I'm not like that. I'm not like that. I'm not like that. I'm not like that. And then when I actually got into treatment and started meeting other people, I was like, oh, none of these people are like that either. And actually, I'm exactly like them. So I wanted to put out an
what you were getting to was this kind of false dichotomy we have with objectivity as being somehow more true and authentic, like this idea that a medical illness that can be easily traced back to a physical condition is easier for people to understand than a mental illness. Or
people, I think I was thinking about people of colour being in touch and being like, these are my experiences, I understand this entirely. You know, because I've had a bit of that too. There's sort of like, we've never seen this written about in a way that makes sense before. And I think those false narratives that exist around these things, written from the outside or whatever, can be really damaging.
And I think that touches on the activist element of personal writing as well. I think certainly the four of us seem quite united with a sense of social justice, which is part of what we're trying to communicate. And you've written a lot from an activist perspective in lots of different ways. How does this memoir feed into your history of feminist activism? How does it kind of play a role?
One of the themes of my book is that is this working? Yeah. Is that I talk about the sort of constant tension in my life, which I think I've always experienced and still do, between wanting to be an activist and always being drawn to activism because I have this strong sense of, you know, not just of social justice, but of, you know, wanting to fix things that I think are wrong, and I can't just see something I think is wrong and walk past. So I have this very strong need to be involved and engaged and to try and do what I can to change things. But against that, I also have this great desire to be an observer and a chronicler and to write about things. And the two things are really kind of at odds, usually. I mean, occasionally I've been able to find a role where I could do both. But, you know, if you're a journalist, you need to be objective, you need to be if you're a political journalist, you need to be non-partisan. You know, you have to sort of write, in those days anyway, I think all this is a bit changing a bit, but Journalism
we millennials
kind
are
of going
changing
down
everything.
some very strange paths, and there's a lot of stuff that I wouldn't call journalism that passes as such. But in my experience anyway, that I needed to find some reconciliation between the activist in me and the observer in me. And so I've walked both sides of the street. You know, I've been a journalist, I've been a bureaucrat, I've been a head of Greenpeace, I've been a Democrat, I've been all these different things. And every time when I'm sitting there in the bureaucracy thinking, oh God, I wish I was out there, on the trenches, I could do much more. And meanwhile, I'm actually changing childcare in the bureaucracy, so it is another form of activism, but it's different, different framework and everything.
Can I ask a question, Anne? Sorry, I was sorry, Zoya, I'm just going to butt in for a second. I thought there was something really interesting and political too about the fact of starting a memoir at 30 and starting a coming-of-age story at 30, and this sort of sense that comes through the book a lot, and especially towards the end, where you're like, this is still a work in progress, this is still happening. When does one, this whole coming-of-age
grow
thing
up?
is... Yeah. I found that really powerful and useful. That's not a question.
I'll take that as a comment.
I'll take that as a comment.
Yeah, sorry. It's like, yeah.
No, I'm happy for mutual fangirling on this panel at any point. I did want to come to you, Siv, about that idea of being both an observer and a participant. So we were talking earlier about the Northern Territory intervention and you being up there as a public servant, but obviously you're directly affected by a lot of these issues. Is this like a joke? Is this some kind of, are we being punked right now? Because I feel like that's happening a lot. But yeah, I wondered if you could tell us a bit of that story, because it's really interesting trying to inhabit the position of both the person who's recording and telling the story, but the person who's also deeply personally affected by those changes and political acts that are being, done to a community, which was very much how the intervention felt, something that was being done to a community, not necessarily with the buy-in of that community.
Yeah. The purpose of my writing now is definitely to be a chronicler of what I've seen and to write it as honestly as I can. And because at this stage, the only person I'm challenging is myself. As I said, I can't control how people will respond to it, but it has to be something that I can live with. So the thing about the Northern Territory intervention, why I felt the need, to write extensively about it, was I just happened to be there. I'd moved back to the Northern Territory. I've lived everywhere, and I particularly like the Northern Territory, so I'd moved back there and just had a public service job. I was a ministerial officer. It was all lovely in a nice office. Listened to ABC Classic FM all day. And then they announced...
How I imagine it.
Yeah, and this was back in the day when if you saw big news on the television. So we were told, go into the tea room, there's going to be an announcement. And so we went in, it was the Prime Minister and Mal Brough, and they announced this thing called the intervention into the Territory. There was a whole heap of measures that went with it, and there was just so much to hear it all in one go. But the thing that we grasped on is that, because we were health department, so there was going to be mandatory health checks of Aboriginal children. They estimated there was about 25,000 children. So, the NT manager and all the rest of the staff looked at me like, what did you know about this? And I said, I didn't know anything. But the thing about it was, no one knew about it. The first thing was the AMA had to come out very quickly and say, we don't do mandatory health checks. Yeah. That's not what we do in Australia. That's actually quite invasive. So that's when they moved to this idea about we could get Defence Force medic teams. And as I said in a little story I tell often, because the perception of the intervention is that the SWAT team came in and with all of their,
personnel.
Yeah, all of that, and they descended on a community. It is true we went in Hercules bombers, but that was purely logistics. And it was the worst kind of plane that you could have in an Aboriginal community because they don't have a sealed strip. So when you land, the entire community is engulfed in dust. And it takes a good hour for it to... So we just walk out of the gloom. But the thing about the personnel that I was with, they were volunteers across the Defence Force. So they were Army, Navy, Air Force, Army Reservists, and they all volunteered to do it. So because they're Defence Force, they can fall into a team and do things, but they weren't actually there as any kind of firepower. They, as I said, in the end, all they were doing, because we weren't allowed to drink the local water, most Aboriginal communities have very poor water supplies. So what these blokes did was every hour they had to give me a bottle of chilled water. So it was basically a team of men that followed me around and gave me water. and that's what, and they played football with the kids. They were quite bored because there wasn't anything to shoot at. The other one of the misconceptions, though, is that there were tanks there. And as I said, you don't know the territory very well if you think we travelled around in tanks, because these are long distances. You're not going to go in a tank.
Yeah.
But what it does is it gives this idea. I mean, certainly it was a terrible idea. If you'd really thought it out, you would have done it completely different.
Yeah.
You would have engaged the Aboriginal Health Services and said, "What are your needs?"
Yeah.
As it was, the burden of dental issues, skin conditions, hearing conditions, babies not being vaccinated. Those were the critical areas. If you'd asked the Aboriginal Health Services, they would have said that.
Yeah, what a novel idea, actually consulting with the community.
Yeah, but I just happened to be there, which is why I wrote about it. But also because I thought, one of the issues that is sort of certainly present in my time is that Aboriginal people not really consulted about our lives. But just touching on when you talk about being a chronicler, just in the last sort of little while, because I'm still sort of working and sort of getting to the point where you think, I think I've actually finished now. And then I received some news last year, and I won't go into details because there were, it did get me thinking, what can I actually write about? So years ago, I just happened to be in a relationship where it wasn't a very successful relationship, and I had decided this isn't working out. So he formed this idea of murder-suicide. Yes, so I won't go into details.
That took a real turn. That
Yes.
wasn't what I was expecting you to say.
Yeah, and at the time, because I had a full-time job, I had a full-time uni load, I had a small child that I was trying to, get into school, and we were going to the theatre, and he was going to karate classes, teaching him how to swim. My mother was in palliative care, we were organising a funeral, and then I've got this bloke on the side. And so I thought, well, you're just a pest.
That's one word for it.
Yeah, well, and that's how it felt. Anyway, I mean, the thing is, it was, I was friends with his sister and I was friends with the whole family, and they were all thought it was a great relationship, the best he'd had. But anyway, I wasn't into it. So, and as you know, kind of when you decide it's over, that's the most dangerous time. But I kind of was like, look, I just don't have time for this, which is literally how it was, because I think when you're in your sort of late 20s, and you've got so much going on, there's only so much, and my priorities were, had nothing to do with him. But at the same time, I didn't, they said, oh, look, he's a bit out, especially after the second time. I won't go into details about it, but it was like, seriously? The second time? Like the first time I was like, what happened? Anyway, then I found out that he had suicided. And I found this out just before Christmas last year. So then I had to go through this whole heap of processing, because I thought, I hadn't actually even anticipated including that story at all in my work, because I thought it was, my mother dying was like, at that time, that was the most significant thing in my life. And I also thought, like, how do I approach someone else's mental illness? Maybe my own, who knows? Like, at the time, because I'm not trivialising mental illness, but the sort of having your mother die, in my case anyway, was a really significant event. It just eclipsed everything. So I thought, really, I'm trying to grapple with how to talk about that period in my life. And being in this relationship just didn't seem to fit within that narrative. Whereas now I'm thinking, well, because of the violence in Aboriginal communities, it's definitely a thing. And also, like, because my experience of it, it wasn't this thing where it was violent and, you were calling the police. He wasn't physically violent at all. But it was, definitely I was in peril, and it would have been devastating for my family. But and just on the end note, just to finish it, but having his family saying, oh, you didn't come to his funeral. I said, well, he tried to kill me twice. And they said, oh, yeah, twice, yeah, it was twice. And I thought that's actually what I was looking for, is because this acceptance that, some relationships don't work out, but that's a big...
Totally, and I think that's
we've
a
normalised it.
Perfect example of a deeply personal experience actually being representative of a much bigger issue.
Yeah.
I do think you've touched on one of the key kind of ethical questions of writing memoir, which is how do you tell other people's stories and how do you include those in your work? And you have a lot of big names in your memoir. There are a lot of people who you're like, oh, Anne got to hang out with all these people. They're like household names. And I suppose you've also got the most experience in terms of telling political stories that inevitably touch on actual people's lives. How have you grappled with that in your career to date? How do you kind of marry that tension of, the right for people to own their story, but also the necessity for some stories to be told?
That's the core of what memoir is about in many ways. Certainly in my first book, Ducks on the Pond, where I tell the story of my family and my upbringing and my childhood, it wasn't physically violent, but it was extremely hostile environment I grew up in, and my father was a very bad drunk, and our lives were pretty terrible. I left home the second I was legally able to. My mother was just devastated by that book and by telling that story. And even though I'd interviewed her about it, she knew I was writing it, but somehow she just didn't kind of register. When I sent her the page proofs, and I sent to her and all my brothers the page proofs, and most of the brothers thought it was great, and they said, thank God, this story should be out there. She just said she couldn't live with it. There's no way she could live with it. And it was very, very tough. And I mean, she eventually came round after lots and lots of people kind of worked on her, not me, but, she went to all the priests and the nuns, and she said, isn't this terrible? And they said, no, actually it's not. And that kind of was quite confronting for her. And eventually she realised that, or she came up with this sort of trope of saying, well, writers have to do this, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, writers have to do this. And it was kind of my psychosis or something that I had to tell this story that... and I had thought, this is an extremely common Australian story. We are not the only Irish Catholic family whose father came back from the war, a total alcoholic, and made the lives of his family hell. And one of the things I've done in this new book, Unfettered and Alive, is to have a little bit of a side journey looking at my father's father and what the First World War did to men of that generation, and how my father's upbringing was a very violent one too, and how actually the violence in our family has reduced and got better. It was shocking for my father, and his father, beat up his brother and broke his arm, broke his jaw, and, the Adelaide Hospital refused to believe that a father could have done this to his, and what he did to my grandmother was. So one of the stories I tell is how, when he died, when this grandfather of mine died, his wife, my nana, and his two sons, my father and his brother, they bored him a hole in the ground, and that was it. Hole in the ground at the West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide. No name tag, no headstone, no cross, no name, nothing. And it wasn't until, he was there for 70 years before my brothers and I decided that we would reclaim him. And so there's a section in my book about how we decided to give him a headstone. Yeah. And how we decided we would confront this issue of, I know I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling another story which I hope is okay.
Of course it's okay.
Answer the question later. So we decided, partly because I'd written another book called The Lost Mother, where I touched on this story, and a woman in her 80s had got in touch with me and said, look, she was the daughter of a World War I veteran, and she had gone to France and seen all the graves of all the unmarked graves of men who died there. And she said, you have a chance to reclaim your grandfather, and you should. So I told my brothers and my cousin, the daughter of the other brother. And then Rosie Batty, happened, and Rosie Batty made that incredible speech, after her son was murdered. And she said that families have to start talking about violence. Yeah. And so we decided this would be our kind of contribution to that thing. So we gave my grandfather a headstone. We decided that we didn't forgive him in any way for his behaviour, but we were willing to acknowledge him and bring him into our family. And so we contacted the War Graves Commission, and we got permission to use the army insignia on the headstone. And we had thought long and hard about what we were going to put on it. And we thought, well, look, his wife and his sons didn't want to bury him and didn't want their names on his headstone, so we didn't feel we could do that. So we just put his name, his dates, his war service, and said, you know, erected by his grandchildren, and we just put our names on it, and that was it. But the really chilling thing, as I write in the book, is when we had this little ceremony in West Terrace Cemetery in Adelaide in late 2014, and it's a really kind of ratty part of the cemetery. It's the Catholic part of the cemetery. It's a bad part. And it's, you know, when we first found the grave, it had a tree growing through it. So whenever we've tidied it up a bit, put this headstone there. But as we kind of finished the cemetery, I kind of looked around and I just couldn't believe there was row after row after row of unmarked graves. So this is common.
I feel like that is actually a really great example of how your experience is telling another story. But it's fascinating to me that as a woman, your memoir has to take part of its time talking about toxic masculinity. Like, what you're talking about is gender norms that reinforce this idea of masculinity in a particular way, in a violent way. I think what you were talking about earlier as well, about your family's reaction to your first memoir, touches on something that Fiona and I were talking about earlier as well, which is this idea that it's not just telling our families stories that seem so confronting to them, but it's also our families suddenly getting this insight into our own mental kind of dialogue that we have with ourselves. And I know that my family were really surprised by a lot that I was grappling with, but it also, for the first time, opened up these conversations about our shared experiences of racism that we just never talked about. And Fiona, you were saying that your mother found it quite confronting to have to relive the pain that you were in some of your essays.
Yeah, and I think that's hard for anybody, right? There are parts of yourselves that you don't share on a day-to-day basis, but then you write about them. You're like, hey, surprise! You know, so yeah, I think it is, you know, the people in your lives who know you as a person, then getting to know you as a character as well is an incredibly difficult and confronting thing for them a lot of the time, and challenging. I like what you said about it opening up conversations with your family, though, too, because I think that certainly happened with Small Acts, that there were some conversations that my family was suddenly able to have in a way that, I always make this joke about the skinniest elephant in the room. It's a terrible joke, but, you know, I'm going to roll with it. You know, so, and it was subtle. They were just small conversations we'd have, or small interactions, like around the dinner table, for example, that would just be changed a little bit, and it did, and kinder, and kinder's not the right word because they were always kind, but just a little bit more attuned to what I was going through and what I needed, and that's been a really wonderful thing.
Yeah, I think it also touches on the idea of permission, which is who do you seek permission from when you're writing a personal story. I like to tell everyone that whilst I did get it in writing from my family that they were okay with me writing a book, a really logical decision, but most people are kind of aghast by this when I tell them. And it's because for me, I wanted to make it really clear that it was my book from my perspective, and whilst they're in it, I'm not trying to speak on their behalf, because, you know, the key thing for me has always been the cultural conflict that exists, not with me in mainstream Australia, but with me and my family, and the huge gap that exists between my parents and myself, which is why it's fascinating to me that so many people have said it reads like a love letter to your family. And it totally is. I just didn't realize that's what I was writing at the time. But Sev, you were talking earlier about this huge pressure to get permission from the community when you're writing. And I think that's really interesting because, again, it presents this idea of one Aboriginal community. Like there's some core group that you can go to and be like, just by the way, I'm going to write about these issues, and someone can give you, you know, an arbitrary tick of approval. How are you kind of navigating that in writing this book? Because you're still deep in the process of actually writing as well.
I mean, it's all but there, but in writing in general, I don't ask permission from anybody. I think, and this is part of the premise of my work, is that when we talk about Aboriginal Australia, there's not much work out there. The ideas that stick, they stick hard. So one of them is about the concept of an Aboriginal community. Now, they certainly exist, like you've got places where people and they associate themselves and they're connected there, but the idea of a Aboriginal community, it is this mythical place where there is this council of people who are able to make decisions, and that does not exist. I mean, when you actually think about it, how would it? Yeah. But it was certainly a thing some decades ago, generations ago. But now, because we're dispersed, and I don't know what the latest figure is, but maybe over 70% of Aboriginal people no longer have Aboriginal partners. So if the community is they're who they've married in with and all of their family, the Aboriginal community has changed considerably because it's pretty much Australia now. Yeah. The idea about having to ask permission, that's all about what can we say that is either going to strengthen our cause or going to damage it. And the idea is about what is dangerous for us. That's what I am interested in, because it's pretty much the same thing. It was, that the outside, people who are not of this kind of Aboriginal that doesn't quite exist anymore, but there's dangers out there if we talk too much about us. So, but really what it got down to is there's no other way to avoid it. It was the men. Because when you talk about the political, it's mainly men who they're sort of dealing with these big picture issues and making these decisions. And my view is what I could see, as I said, it's over a 50-year period, is that in that equation, the women are the ones that suffer and the children aren't even factored in at all. So what I've been saying for the last few years is if we're pushing these positions, the women's status is not going to be elevated. We're going to continue to be held down, and you are sacrificing other people's children. Yeah. Because if we all stick to this plan. So when I say we, I mean these are the kind of general discussions that go on. We're all different, of course, but it's pretty obvious that there is a dominant narrative and there's a prevailing point of view. So my approach is I'm interested in the status of women. I don't know whether it's because I come from a matrilineal society, if it's just a coincidence. Matrilineal as in we're not the leaders, because the leaders, that concept doesn't really exist anyway in our sort of life. But it was because, if you're talking about the big picture and the good stuff will filter down eventually, I can see that adhering to that point of view, it hasn't worked. And I don't know, you might know where it was. There was footage, it's black and white footage, and there's a group of Aboriginal women and a group of, I think they were described as white feminists. But there was some sort of meeting that was in Canberra, so black and white, I'm thinking it was the 70s. But I don't know what they were talking about because there's always a voiceover. Sorry, I just had a drink. But what it seemed to me was there was this, how I interpret it was there was this yearning on the faces of the black women because they could see, talking to white women, that there was, and I don't really like to use those expressions anymore, but they could tell by talking to this other group that women's rights were important, because that's not a thing that we generally talk about in the Aboriginal community. We talk about community, family, warriors, there's all of these kind of tropes that sort of exist in our world. But women, it's just in recent times that people have started to run campaigns around women. But as far as I can see it, it's always secondary. Yeah.
Well, if I could just say something there. In the very early days of the women's movement, say like in the early 70s, there were Aboriginal women and other women of colour were definitely involved. And I know there's a bit of mythology around now that it was all just, white women and nobody else. That's not true. Yeah. And certainly Marcia Langton was always involved. Bobby Sykes, the late Bobby Sykes was very involved. Mm-hmm. Sakai Holland, who, the Rhodesian woman or Zimbabwean woman, who then went back to Zimbabwe and, became a minister in the Mugabe government back before it, turned into the horrifying regime that it became. And that's just, and there are many others, like Mum Shaw was also involved. There are many other women, and we used to have meetings. I don't know the particular footage that you're referring to, but then I didn't live in Canberra. Mm. But there were certainly in all the early big meetings that we had, there were always voices from women of colour. And, and although, when my book, Damned Whores and God's Police came out, I was criticised because it didn't, it wasn't inclusive enough of Aboriginal women, and I agree that was a fault, but it wasn't because I wasn't conscious, but because we didn't have the dialogue, we didn't have the ways of talking about it that we have, tried to develop over the years. But nevertheless, I think there was more connection and more integration and more mutual interest and acceptance than there has been for a long time since. And it's a shame that we lost that.
Absolutely, I can see, because there was the 70s, I was conscious of this, and then 80s, 90s, like a lot of black women, when the universities started extending mature age education and created enclaves at universities for black people, we all in droves went to university. And there was this idea that if, it was still dragging on in the 90s, that if you chose to be educated, then it was like you were agreeing to assimilation, and there was all of this kind of criticism that came down on women. There were men at university as well, but this idea was that we shouldn't be getting educated. But by the 90s, certainly we were a lot more. The thing about education is it gives you access to other ideas, and we just weren't interested. It was almost comical. But you could also hear vestiges of what people have been saying for decades. We're all about the same age, us women, and now I can see, there are still pockets of that kind of holding people back, simply because not everyone has died who was around when these ideas formed and took hold. So I don't know the language around feminism because it just wasn't part of how we spoke about ourselves. But definitely I know what it's like to be, as a woman, to be, held down.
But if you talk to Larissa, for example, Larissa Berent, she, a couple of years ago, I think it was about 2 years ago now, we had a conference actually at UTS to mark the 40th anniversary of the Damned Halls and God's Police. And it was not a conference about me, it was a conference about the book and the ideas and its legacy and its relevance for today. And Larissa gave one of the keynote addresses, and it was an absolutely brilliant address, which I can find. I've got it somewhere in my computer. But she talked about the impact of that book on her as a young Aboriginal woman. And contrary to the view that this was this terrible white racist book, which, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but people were very critical of it from that point of view, Larissa had a completely different take on it. And that was it. Said I can't remember her exact words, so I don't want to misquote her. But she certainly learned. She took things from the book about the way in which Aboriginal women have been treated in the frontier days, the colonial days. That she thought the analysis that I brought to that told her things that were very valuable to her, and that she thought that she certainly could identify with contemporary feminism of the early 70s, even though she was quite young. I think she was just a kid. But I just think her perspective is one that challenges this narrative that we've sort of had over the last few years.
And I think that definitely touches on something that we were talking about earlier around allowing diversity within marginalised communities and allowing for a multitude of opinions instead of kind of having the one approved voice that we all have to kind of adhere to. Audience had a question at this point. Yep. Just yell it out. Yeah. Oh, wait. They are bringing a mic. No worries. I think someone's just... Oh, you need one of them? Oh, you got the two. Sorry. Oh, you're right. There is a there's multiple microphones coming at you now, so fabulous. Just choose one.
Okay. Two questions. The first one's for Steve. You mentioned that I think 70% of Aboriginal people are no longer with Aboriginal partners. Is that why is that, and is that an issue is that a very troubling issue within the Aboriginal community? And I'll just let you ruminate over that while I ask the second question, and this is for Anne. I really liked what you said about your aunt, and I noticed in the past maybe 12 months of me intensely reading a lot of feminist women writers that they've often mentioned aunts and the impact they've had. And I wonder if it's necessarily because the aunts and the female writers haven't had children, and I wonder if it's necessarily the fact that they haven't had children that they've been able to make this other narrative of modeling another way of living, and if that's something that we should celebrate more, or I don't know.
Well, just in answer, thank you for the question. I mean, that stat, it's around somewhere. I don't know the exact number, but it's quite clear from my own observations that that's what's happening. Some of it is because we've moved from being to sort of small Aboriginal communities and people have moved into other areas, and you just meet someone, and we're not necessarily looking for someone who's Aboriginal. I think part of the Aboriginal community, in some ways, this is one of the reasons why we've probably suffered unduly, is we accept anybody. And also this also extends to if you have a relationship with someone who's out of the group, it's not particularly taboo. I don't think, because it's just because it's so common, I guess. Now I'm interested in why. Why has that happened? Now, because of not just the violence between gendered violence, but one of the things about having intergenerational trauma is that there is a lot of other kinds of violence that's in the community. They call it lateral violence. It's just and some of the controls, it's actually not coming from older people, it's from younger people. So, and of course, if you're sort of like third, fourth, fifth generation, where you've had like all of these things have happened and it hasn't been dealt with properly, then this is where it's coming out. It's in the younger generation. So, in some cases, people would leave a community because they don't. It's very uncomfortable to be around families who aren't coping, to put it quite bluntly. I chose to move to Bourke in 2000 when it was described as the most dangerous town in Australia, and I thought, what does that look like? Because that wasn't where I came from, so I moved out there, and I thought, I bet it's because of the Aboriginal people. They're not saying it's the most dangerous town because of the black people, but I suspected it had something to do with that, and it was the crime, mainly. A lot of robbery, arson, sexual assault, lots of intimidation. It has a population where, mainly young people, children, a few teenagers, a few older people. People get out if they can. Poverty, illness, all the rest of it. That's the kind of community that you would leave if you could. And one of the good things is because I somehow got talked into doing youth work. I didn't move out there to do youth work. I was offered a job running a crisis centre working with the families. And when they said with the kids, I said, oh no, I don't like the kids here. And I wasn't joking, because I said, they've already broken into my house 6 times. And you sort of, again, you normalise things like you have 2 dogs, and sorry for anyone who's a dog lover, but the reason why you have 2 is if you have one, they can kill your dog. If you have 2, they're looking for the other one. So you get 2. So yeah, I mean, I had ferocious dogs. They were lovely, never bit me. But the thing is like you have all of without realising I was only there for 3 years, but you start to live a particular way, and things that you see which would horrify me now to even think about it or write about it would just become normal. But I think this is one of the reasons why, for your children, and I think it is women. It's primarily women. You want a better life for your children, and this is what we were saying when we were at university, having access to feminist works. Very few of them were written by black women, unless they were American. But this idea that women were entitled to think about their lives, and so for us, it was a very clear decision when you had, like the blokes from the music centre or something saying, education's white, and we said, no, well, we're entitled to look after our children. So,
And yourself.
Yes, and yourself. And this is the thing, is it always seemed to be like we had to have a reason why we're entitled to what is actually quite, it's a human right. Yeah. So that's long answers.
I can't wait to read your book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Hurry up and finish it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Aunts. Well, I had, I think, quite a few aunts, and as I said, 2 of them were housewives, and one was a nun, and the other one was the interesting one. And without being mean to mothers, but as the oldest of 6 children, and I was 14 when the youngest was born, so I did a lot of nappy changing and all that stuff, and it didn't really strike me as what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I was really grateful to my Auntie Nance, who was the one. She just worked in a bank. She was a bank teller in a country town in New South Wales. It probably was quite a low-level job, but for me, she was the most glamorous person I'd ever met. because she had money. She was independent. She took me to a nice restaurant in Melbourne, a Florentino's, which was incredibly glamorous and sophisticated for me. And it just made me realise that there were other opportunities. Now, I'm an aunt. I have a lot of nephews and nieces. And, you know, I think some of them regard me as quite an exotic creature. But I'm in touch with most of them, and I do my best to encourage them and in whatever they want to do. But I agree. I think the role of aunts is something that ought to be sort of more celebrated and appreciated, and particularly if the aunts are, you know, Auntie Mame is a great role model, I think, if anyone, you know that film. But we do have we not being those of us who are aunts who aren't married with children but who have other lives can perhaps be a little bit of a guiding light for young women who are looking for a different path as well.
I love that. My one ambition is to be the cool auntie to my 4 nieces and 1 nephew. And I did have a great moment where my eldest niece, who's 9, came to my house, and you know, I live in an apartment, unmarried to my white partner, and I have a cat. And apparently she went home and said, all I want is to live in an apartment with a cat. She didn't say anything about the unmarried partner, but I think she's a bit young for that.
Yeah. I was just going to say I was nodding along furiously because, you know, I'm like, this is the auntie I want to be too.
Yeah, 100%. We should start some kind of club. I like it. Feminist aunts. Any other questions? Yep, I've got one here. Oh, nope, stop there.
For Zoya, for someone who is writing as like a young feminist, you must be often like stigmatized with that sort of, you're not teenage, but like that sort of young teenage or young female angst. Do you often find that you're disregarded or like undermined in like what you're trying to say just because you are young and you haven't had that experience?
Yeah, totally. I also look younger than I am. My favorite story to tell people is how I was in Scotland last year, and I was in this house by myself, and some Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on the door, and when I answered it, they asked me if my parents were home. And I was like, I'm 28, but thank you. So yes, I do get that a lot, and something that I wanted to bring up on the panel was actually how when you write from personal experience as well, and you're young, and you're a woman, people tend to really fixate on the personal drama aspect of your work. And my book is really entirely about cultural context and a political analysis of why we have gender and racial inequality, and the ways in which that affects your life when you're growing up as a migrant in Australia. And I'm always surprised by how often journalists will ask me what my parents thought, what my partner thought, you know, what the personal fallout has been, without interrogating the ideas in the book. And that's what I'm interested in talking about. So I do think you get stigmatized with that quite a bit. And I am also sick of being asked how I could possibly have something to write about when I'm so young.
Oh my God, yeah.
You know,
yep,
because memoir is an autobiography. I'm a bit like, this isn't like the story of my life. It's actually about the issues and ideas that I find interesting and that challenge me. And I do think that writing in general is a conceit. You know, you're writing because you think you have something to say and you want people to engage with that, and you have to live with that as a writer. It is kind of a condition, as you said before.
What about all these 19-year-old footballers who write their autobiographies?
Right?
Well,
I know.
They don't actually write them, though. Someone writes them for them.
But they
I actually would love to be a ghostwriter. So, by the way, if anyone knows of a 19... I've heard that. I have heard that.
Yeah. I have several friends who are ghostwriters, so they do quite well.
Oh, well, you know, if they know how to get into it.
I've done a bit of it in my time, but I'm not allowed to talk about it.
Exactly.
Love that. That was a bit of a
Just
tangent.
take the money, don't worry about the glory.
Another question up the back.
Hi, a question for the whole panel, but perhaps Anne might start. I'm actually working on a memoir-style book at the moment that will be published next year about a very bad relationship that went wrong, and I'm struggling with the subject that you were talking about before, about permission, when it's okay to write about other people. The person that I'm referring to throughout the book is not being named, but there'll be level of identification, and I guess it's something I'm doing it, but I'm grappling with it as I go, and I'd be really grateful for when does someone forfeit the right to to tell their own story? When is it okay for me to step in and do it?
Well,
that's a very, very tough one, and I didn't answer the question when Zoya asked me about it before, but she was talking more about well-known people and how you deal with that. But when it's somebody you've had a relationship with, even if that person's not named, they're going to be known. They're going to know for a start, and your circle of friends will know. And that person can come forward and say and dispute your version. Is there any way you can negotiate with the person in advance? No. Is the person going to take action, do you think?
The defamation lawyers will be very interested in my manuscript, I think.
Right. I mean, it's hard because you're entitled to your story. He or she is entitled to theirs. And the balance between those two things is what you are striving to arrive at, and your publishers will have to give you some advice on that. I mean, the defamation laws in this country are very, very tough, and it makes it very hard to tell certain types of stories. I think it's a big issue for me too, but that's another subject. But I would urge you to be careful. I mean, if it ended badly and the other person is still very upset and angry, they're not going to take it lightly if you write a book about it. So I would maybe find some way to
It's a little complicated. There's personality disorders involved and psychopathy things. So
is it potentially dangerous?
Yes, potentially.
Well, you've got to take that very seriously,
yes.
I think. Very.
Sorry,
it's not advice. It's just, I'm just regarding your safety. You have to be very careful.
I think that's fantastic advice. Fiona, did you want to say anything about the permissions aspect? Because we kind of didn't touch on that with your experience at all.
Oh God. Only to say that it's very hard. And I think it's different for each piece, and for each writer. Different considerations come into account, and it's different for each book too. I was, in my first book, some of the experiences I wrote about were being in hospitals with other patients, and I wanted to be very careful with those stories, because another kind of preoccupation of anorexia is the way that you present in the world and what people think of you, kind of having a really high value and worrying a lot about what people think of you, and the face that you show to the world. So trying to control that and shut it all down. So I thought it would be a violence to present someone else's face to the world from my perspective, if that was something that they were already nervous about. In the second book, there's less of that. It's more sort of family and friends and things like that. And I am quite happy to admit that I don't know how to negotiate those ethics, and I'm still figuring it out, and I'm still making mistakes. And my approach is always just to try and have conversations with people. But obviously, when you can't have conversations with those people, what do you do?
I think it's about finding that balance, both within yourself and I think, taking the safety aspect into consideration of what you're willing to possibly lose and what you think the world can gain from a certain story. Like, I wrote a whole other memoir years ago and then was like, I can't publish this until my parents die. So this book is the book that I can publish while they're alive. Somebody, in fact, on the radio yesterday, I was asked, did you think that you had to wait until your family was dead, basically? And I was like, there'll be other memoirs when they are dead. Like, I'm sure that'll happen. I'm waiting for that. But this one is for now, because I do think you have to take very seriously the impact that it can have on your relationships, and it is a hard one to navigate. My family are like characters now.
Yeah.
My mother said she wished I'd waited till she was dead.
Yeah.
But I do find this fascinating though, right? Because there are a bunch of male writers who write very personally, and I'm thinking of our friend Knausgaard here, who don't give a damn.
Yeah.
And they're like, I'm going to blow up my life, don't care. I am not that person, and I'm yet to meet a woman writer who is.
Yeah, I do think women are judged very harshly for their supposed treatment of other people, and are expected to be responsible for that in a way that men aren't.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. Yep. You were very quick with your hand there.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for sharing your stories and talking about your work. I have a question about readers. There was a session here yesterday that unfortunately I couldn't be at, about whether men read fiction. I want to ask about whether you think, and Anne is probably at the centre of this given that you're right in the middle of a book tour, about whether men read narrative nonfiction by women, because I think I'm a publisher and a writer, and anybody who goes into a bookstore or looks at promotions around Father's Day will get a very particular view about what's being pushed to male readers and the women who buy books for them. And let me tell you, it's not feminist non-fiction.
I don't know, my book was on a recommended for Father's Day shelf, and I had a little giggle thinking about the poor dad who got that book for Father's Day.
Well, maybe I can start, Pip. Because, yes, I've had 2 weeks and I've got another 2 weeks to go. I'm travelling all around Australia doing lots and lots of events. And it is true that the majority of the audiences who come to see me are women, but not exclusively, but mostly women. But
Can I point out we've got like one man in the audience here?
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
But there's one.
But one thing that I've been quite struck by when I first arrived here is the number of men, and particularly some quite well-known men in, I probably shouldn't name them, but men in kind of big media positions at the ABC on a Monday night, who have just like devoured the book and love it because of the politics, and they love all the stories about the early journalism and stuff, and that's kind of been gratifying that if that's a way into the rest of the story, that's great, that's fine. But the other thing is I've discovered the number of Australian men, maybe of a certain age, who are huge Joni Mitchell fans. And so so a lot of meeting lots and lots of women who had no idea that the title refers to a Joni Mitchell song, because they'd never. In fact, I was having my makeup done the other day at Channel 7, and they said, "I what's your book about?" And I tried to explain to them, and eyes glazed over. I said the title is from a Joni Mitchell song, and one woman was doing my hair, the other was doing my face, because we had 5 minutes before I went on air, and the one who was doing my hair said, "Never heard of her," and the one doing my face said, "Yes, I've heard of her because of that movie, Love Actually."
Oh, God.
Oh, God.
And, you all know the story. So a lot of it's generational, I think, but the men, I mean, I've had one man send me a playlist from my book tour of all these really obscure tributes to Joni Mitchell, Herbie Hancock, and all sorts of other singers who've done amazing Joni Mitchell tributes. So I think that's great. So I'm going to mark up my book now that, the feminist memoir that even men like.
Well, do you know, it's funny because the response I get, I know that most of my readers are women, and I love that, actually. I think I'm writing for women, and great, but when I do encounter male readers, often they say, "Oh, I wasn't expecting to like your book, but I did," as if that's some huge. I'm like, thanks, Yeah.
I would love, I would just really like one man in particular to read my book, mostly for book sales. I reckon if Andrew Bolt could get really angry about it on Sky. I've been waiting for that. I don't know if I should ask someone to send it.
We're going to be arranged.
Yeah, I'm considering sending a copy anonymously, just to get that going, but that's my marketing brain. What about you, Siv? Do you feel as if your work will be consumed equally by both genders?
I mean, it's certainly something I thought about when I was framing how I was going to write it, like who is the audience. And I guess to engage with my work. And just as a little story, I wrote this other series, and it was there was a male character in it, and it was just this sort of series that I did. And I was approached by a fella who runs a literary event, and they were doing something for Valentine's Day. And he said, "Could you do a reading of that story? I think it's fantastic for Valentine's Day." And I said, "It's not really a Valentine story." I mean, it's about this bloke who comes out of jail, and it's his experiences when he's in jail. And, you can, if you boil water and put honey in it and throw it on someone, their flesh will just come straight off.
Oh, yeah, so romantic.
Yeah, anyway, so I did this reading.
Valentine's Day commemorates martyrs as well.
maybe that's where he was coming from. But the thing is, so there was all these other people, and they got up and they told their little stories, and they're all lovely. And then I thought, oh, and then I got up and told mine. It was complete silence. And at the end, you know, you get that kind of bit scared clapping. But I said to my sister, I said, how come people don't like my work? Because my sister was then, she said, you scare people, love. But he said, and later he said, oh, that was great. And I said, I'm still not really sure why you asked me. He said, I thought it was beautiful. Well, he actually didn't say it in that voice. He said, I thought it was beautiful. But the thing about it is there was something about the intimacy, the way I created this character and the inner world of this character that he really liked. And as someone said to me, someone I really admire, because he read it, and he said, Siv, have you been in jail? And I said, no, Bruce, I haven't been in jail. And he said, oh, well, I have, and you really get those bastards.
There you go. I feel like... I think there's two lessons from that. One is you never know who's going to read your book, and I think the second is that you shouldn't allow your sister to write the cover quote for your book.
Oh, I thought the lesson was I know how to burn someone's flesh off now.
Yeah.
If there's one thing you take from the Feminist Writers Festival.
Yes. Sorry.
I think that's all we have time for today. I don't know if will you... Yeah, sure.
Keep going.
That's a beautiful note to end on, isn't it? Thank you all so much for coming along. There will be book sales and signing now, so you can purchase copies of Anne, Fiona and Zoya's books at the Glee bookstall, and they'll be happy to sign and have a chat as well. There are some tickets remaining for this afternoon sessions and for this evening's as well, so you can jump online, have a look at the program and buy a couple of tickets. Thank you all for coming. Big thanks to UTS for hosting us. Please join me in thanking Zoya Patel, Siv Parker, Fiona Wright and Anne Summers.